I was hunting around for an AES logo today. I'm not quite sure I got the right one. The American Equilibration Society. It's internet anyway, you know. So we're going to talk tonight about current trends in audio for visual media. The exciting thing that's just starting to happen now is ultra high definition television. Of course, everybody wants to sell us the same stuff again with more bits in it, and but it's very important for us because this is going to be, I would guess, the last iteration of television in our lifetimes, and we don't want it to be AC3. I live in Australia now. I grew up here in Chicago. I went to DePaul University. Grew up actually in Oak Lawn. I live in Cairns, Australia now, which is where the arrow is about. A lot of people don't know about Australia. Usually this gives everybody a pretty good handle on what Australia is all about. I was 20 years in Los Angeles, and Australia, the landmass is about the size of the US, but it has the population of Los Angeles total. So it's obviously a very different place to run. So we're going to talk about a few things today. Importance of listening. Quite often that gets kind of short shrift with all the equipment and everything that we do all the time. But ultimately, listening to what we're doing, listening to the things around us is very important. Then we're going to talk about the changes in cinema audio, the changes that we've made the last 7 or 8 years to digital cinema, and what's going to come out of that here in the near future. And this is one of the things that's going to come out of that. What we're insisting really be called immersive sound. I fought at the TC level to stop people from calling it 3D audio, in part because I didn't want to get attached to 3D picture, which is going away again. And then we're going to talk about ultra high definition television, which is going to take a lot of what we learned in digital cinema and expand on that. And as kind of an adjunct to that, we're going to talk about high frame rate pictures as well. In 1961, my parents drove us down to Florida, not much different than the Griswolds. And as many of you know who drove a lot in the Midwest in the 1960s, this was kind of a ubiquitous feature on the road. Our first trip down there, we stayed at this motel in Fort Myers, Florida. It was $12 a night. I was 7 years old. But I had already read up about what was going on in this town, and there's a little clue down there in the phone number. Fort Myers was Thomas Edison's winter home and laboratory, and I used to really enjoy visiting Edison's place, in part because to me Edison was really my hero. He invented all the things that I love and that I've worked with in my life: motion pictures, recorded music, and electricity. I like that one too. Edison was not just an inventor, not just a scientist. He was also a marketer. And unfortunately, he gave us in audio some of the bad marketing techniques that we use today. This one was called the tone test. When he was introducing new models of his recorders, or playback devices, he would take usually some kind of opera singer out. They'd go into a hall in a small town or in a medium-sized city, and he'd set everything up behind a screen, and he'd kind of dare the audience to decide, was it the the playback device or was the real guy? Well, we know how absurd that is. But they would dutifully go off and write, you couldn't tell the difference between Edison's machine and the real person. That's led to a lot of the exaggeration we have in audio today and a lot of the hucksterism that goes on. We know these people. You know, I would have thought for sure when digital came along, they were going down. It hasn't happened. So it's up to us to really listen to what we're doing and make judgments for ourselves and not be affected by the popular winds of the time or even people that we know. When I first got to Hollywood in 1977, the sound mixer that I worked with, I asked him, I said, what can I do to really do myself a service as a sound engineer? And he said, you've got to be calibrated. He says, the only calibration is symphonic music. He says, there's no microphones, there's no speakers. This is what the instruments sound like. He says, if you don't know what they sound like, you can't record them very well. And being raised in a jazz school, both in Oak Lawn, where I grew up, and at DePaul, classical music was quite a stumper for me. Last weekend, the Chicago Symphony played Mahler's Ninth. I was there 2 out of the 4 nights. So it's become a really regular part of my listening habit. Then several years later, I was doing a picture called Rhinestone with Sylvester Stallone and Dolly Parton. Don't hold that one against me either. I've actually done 5 pictures with Dolly, and that's the only name drop you'll get out of me. She's been really wonderful to me over the years. So the sound mixer, Michael Evia, the compact discs had only been out a short time, and he railed on the sound of the discs and how there weren't enough bits on there to do classical music, and how all the violins got screechy and distorted, and he proceeded to pull out a Tchaikovsky recording of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony. And towards the end of the last movement, the strings get all high and screechy, and he says, see, yeah, that's why you can't listen to that, you know. Actually, it wasn't Tchaikovsky, it was the Prokofiev, I'm sorry, the Prokofiev. And about a year later, I had occasion to hear this piece played in Los Angeles. And I was sitting at the symphony with my eyes closed, listening like I always do. And they got to that part, and if the violins weren't screechy and distorted in the house. And in fact, it was an effect that Prokofiev and a lot of the Russian composers knew that they could create with the interference, the high frequency interference in the high strings. And the CDs were actually capturing that pretty well. So this is a slide I borrowed from Floyd Toole. This is a classic Floyd Toole. All the equipment and measurement techniques and everything we have don't equal the brain. And it's very important that ultimately the brain make the decision and not what we're doing over here. This can give us some clues sometimes, but it can't tell us the whole story. So you heard talk about On Golden Pond. This was the second feature film I did after getting to Hollywood. I was the youngest member of the crew. I was scared to death. And I got the job of holding a boom mic standing this deep in water for quite a bit of the picture. A lot of the picture was recorded with only 1 take or 2 takes. We also shot in sequence because these actors were playing themselves, and the director didn't even want rehearsals where they were saying the words. So they came to us early in production and said, take as much time as you need, make sure you're set up for anything they can do, because We don't want multiple takes of anything. So here's a clip from this picture. This picture was interesting because for a number of reasons. We were all nominated for an Oscar for Best Sound. It's a dialogue picture. There's a little bit of music in it, no effects to speak of. It's just people talking. That hasn't happened since 1981. The dialogue picture's been nominated. All the dialogue in the picture is production dialogue. There's only one line that was stolen from a different take, but there's no looping, there's no replaced dialogue anywhere. And this movie was released in mono, not in Dolby Stereo. Dolby Stereo was about 10 years old at this point. And the reason was because we knew by 1980 that if the Matrix system that Dolby had based Dolby Stereo on wasn't aligned properly and screwed up in the theaters, you lost the dialogue. Hence, going into the theater and hearing it like this. So the movie has since been remixed a little bit into stereo, where the music has been spread out a little bit. But this was a monaural movie. So I'm going to play a little piece of it here, and your task is to listen for the replaced line.
Do I have to put an ad in the paper?
I'm not sure know how to pick strawberries.
It's really very simple, Norman. You bend over and you pick them.
Bend over?
Mm-hmm.
Where are they?
On the ground, where they belong.
You tell me to pick blueberries on a bush. You didn't have to bend over at all.
These are strawberries and they grow on the ground.
Oh, here comes what's his name. He'll have the paper, you know. I don't want to miss any career opportunities. Off looking for strawberries.
I'll pay you, Norman. Maybe the beginning of something big. You may become a major strawberry picker.
Not if I'm bending over all the time. I think you're trying to kill me.
I thought about it.
Well, you needn't bother. I'm living on borrowed time as it is.
Will you take your cheery personality and get out of here?
I hope you're prepared to massage my bent back this evening.
With pleasure.
Maybe I can lie down to pick the berries.
Anybody hear the replaced line? Yeah, that's how we could get away with it. He says, maybe I can lie down and pick them. This was take 3. The first 2 takes he turned in my direction. The third one he decided to turn the other way. So I missed it. And that's the one, of course, they liked. And that's the one we printed. And fortunately, you have good sound editors who are able to go get something else and make it work. So we're back to this summary about listening critically. Having known references for audio events is very important, and we'll talk about that a little more later when we start talking about immersive sound. But essentially, a lot of what's happening with immersive sound now is sound effects that none of us have any frame of reference for. They're not real sounds. They're manufactured sounds. So how can anybody make a judgment on the quality of a system that's producing sound that we have no reference for? Now we're going to talk about digital cinema and kind of how we got to where we're at now with digital cinema. Film and cinema was really the first use of high power audio in large rooms. And by high power audio, I mean the 3-watt amplifiers with tubes in them and very, very large horn speakers. Up until about the mid 1970s, very few people had ever heard a stereo movie. I know when I was a kid, we used to go down to the Chicago Theater or the State and Lake and hear roadshow cinema where they had mag sound on 70mm prints. The average person never heard stereo in a movie theater. And so in the late 1980s, when we got digital optical sound, it created quite a bit of chaos in the industry. Let me go back to a little different story here at the moment. When we were at AES in New York in October, I had nominated a gentleman by the name of Ron Uhlig for an award from the AES. Ron Uhlig wasn't even a member of the AES. Ron Uhlig was, in his whole career, an engineer at Eastman Kodak. And it was through Ron Uhlig's efforts that the film industry went from mono optical sound to stereo optical sound. Essentially two squiggly lines in the place where there used to be just one squiggly line. And at the time he did that, the philosophy at Kodak was, we invent things for the movie industry. If the industry decides to do something with them, good for them. We don't want any royalties. We don't want, we just do this engineering for the film industry. It was at that moment that Dolby was looking around for other places to put Dolby A noise reduction. And they did that, and then they found, they got the idea that, gee, we could matrix these two channels into four, a technique that had been done by Bob Hafler years and years ago. And that's how we got Dolby Stereo. Ron Uhlig's efforts in that had been clouded over history, and I thought it was time that the AES make sure that the full picture of the contributions to that were available from the AES. He's also done an oral history interview, which will be up later this month, and I urge you to take a look at that. It's a real good look at the film industry. But the standards we had, acoustical standards primarily in the movie theaters, once we went to digital sound, essentially collapsed. The SMPTE, who's responsible for those standards, was reticent to open that Pandora's box up. And it's taken quite some time for them to do that, and there's an effort underway now to do that. But essentially what happened was, when we have a roll-off curve that's called the X curve, that was originally implemented because speakers looked like this. And the soundtrack was loaded with noise up at high frequencies, so nobody was talking up there anyway, so we just rolled it all off, and that was kind of brute force noise reduction. When digital came along, you'd think we would have wanted to open it up, but the Dolby Digital in particular, because of the compression scheme, is missing a lot of high frequencies. In 1983, the head of the sound department at Universal Studios organized an A/B demonstration for about 400 sound mixers one night. They had a big symphonic film soundtrack, and you could switch between the Dolby Digital and the DTS. Universal Studios had an investment in DTS, so it was important to them that they show Hollywood at least what it is what it is we were missing. And I don't remember what the first switch was from Dolby to DTS or vice versa, but 400 sound mixers laughed involuntarily. And the next morning, our friends at Dolby came in and took all the DS4 encoders out of the studio, and they were left out for about 2 weeks until an agreement was made to never do that again. But it was what most of us suspected. So the X curve was retained to maintain the integrity of the digital soundtrack, essentially. This is also where a lot of the hiss came from. And then, so here's the optical soundtrack. This is as it was originally on monofilm, and then this was when we went to digital. SDDS, they were the second people into the market, and they grabbed this space for their usage. And as you can see, there's a whole lot more space there than there is between the sprockets where Dolby ended up. And in between the sprockets is also where the most film damage occurred. But they were the last ones to the party. That's all that was left. And we had to carry the analog optical still, and then on the very edge you carry timecode to drive the DTS system. So these are what the prints have been for the last 25 years. When we started working on digital cinema, as most of you know, is essentially taking the final cut film, it's ingested into a digital format in 4K and 4,000 line picture. And when we were writing the standards for this and how to do this, several of us on the SMPTE Standards Committee insisted that there would be no codecs in between us and what was happening. And there was a lot of resistance to that because people have been nailing codecs on our shoes for a long, long time. We ended up with 24-bit audio at 48 or 96 kilohertz. And we have up to 16 full bandwidth channels. When we started working on this and had this framework in place, John Ergel, may he rest in peace, came to me after one of the SMPTE meetings and said, this is the time to fix the acoustical problem. Because if you have a fix that eliminates some or all of the X curve, a little metadata flag in the theater can tell the soundtrack, play back as if the theater has X curve, play back as if it doesn't. The film industry doesn't want double inventory of anything, and this was the time for us to start making a difference, and that's why the push now is on to do that. First at SMPTE, and then now at the AES, we have a standards committee that's working on the issue of calibration of sound systems in large rooms, which is essentially what this is. The only expertise SMPTE or the film industry brings to it is the screen. And there's a lot we don't know about the screen, by the way. But we've got both organizations working mostly harmoniously to work through this challenge now. So, like I said, we only want to have one mix to service all of the markets. So at the moment, that's not the case. The dubbing rooms mix a film in a dubbing room that ostensibly has an X curve in it, and those mixes are not bright enough for near field use, for small room use, for home use. And so those mixes all have to be redone again for DVD. There's a wide range of equipment out in the field. You know, here in a big city, it's not so bad. You go to Manhattan, Kansas, or places like that, and you can find anything and everything. And there's never been a lot of work done on what modern motion picture theaters really should acoustically perform like. We had THX, which Tom Holman worked on in the 1980s, and he was faced with all the challenges we were all faced with. Intelligibility problems, for example, being a serious one. And ultimately he threw up his hands and said, well, if I make the rooms dead enough, there won't be any reflections and they won't interfere with intelligibility. But what we know now, of course, and what Floyd Toole talks about in his book, is that you've got to have especially first lateral reflections to give the room some life, to give the sound some life. So we still have that challenge of deciding what movie theaters should sound like. Then we move on to 3D. You could judge from my comments earlier, I'm not a big fan of 3D. This time, nor the previous 2 times in my career in Hollywood. There was more hope for it this time because the problem always with 3D was that you had two pieces of film someplace in the system, and they could never be registered perfectly, so you had judder between those 2 pieces of film. And that judder, combined with all of the other artifacts, really made it not viable for a lot of the audience. When we went to digital cinema and digital capture, there were a lot of people that thought, well, we're going to eliminate all that judder and it should be better now. It's better, but it's still what it is. Roger Ebert, I think most of you would know, really hated the whole idea of 3D. And he got a letter from Walter Murch, who's won Oscars for sound editing and sound design and sound mixing, and I think sweeping out the sound studios. And Walter explained very clearly why, in his view, the human brain wasn't designed to watch 3D pictures the way we were doing it. So I think we're almost done with that current iteration of 3D. But that left us with a problem. After Avatar came out, the sound directors at all the big studios were really all in a panic because they realized that we were short on the sound end from what picture was able to do. The thing we were really short on was that picture is able to move the picture in and out from the screen. We had no ability to do that with sound. There have been lots of 3D sound formats proposed over the years. The first system I heard was the Iasono system. That uses what's called wave synthesis to move the sounds around the theater, and it moves the sounds as objects. And you're going to be hearing the word objects a lot now as sound engineers because we're moving towards describing these events as objects. The only problem with the Iasono system was it required panels of speakers to go around the entire theater. They suddenly realized it was never going to be, nobody was ever going to pay to do this. They're putting it in specialty venues and World's Fair kind of operations now. And it's a shame because I think it has the best potential to give the audience the widest view of immersive sound. So then we've got these other systems, the Aura 3D system, which is supported by Barco and more recently by DTS. DTS has decided to stay out of the theatrical production game on this system, but they have a tool called MDA, Multi-Dimensional Audio, that they got from SRS when they bought a SRS earlier this year. And MDA is being proposed as an interchange format between all of these formats. The Aura 3D system is essentially an 11-channel system where the objects and the motion are mapped into those 11 channels in the theater. not necessarily 11 speakers, quite often more than 11 speakers. And then you of course know about the Atmos system. The Atmos system is also object-based. It's a proprietary format. It's designed to be carried as a second format on the digital cinema masters. But all of this sprung out of the work at NHK in Japan. A gentleman by the name of Kimio Hamasaki, who was actually elected AES president-elect for next year, but is ill at the moment and has had to decline the election. Kimio, however, knows more about this subject than anybody. They've done more research and more hard science at NHK about how motion is carried in a movie theater. This is the ITU's suggested format for immersive sound, essentially with two rows of speakers. You've got standard kind of surrounds, and then you've got the height channel, which is really where you get your motion from. This is how an Aura 3D system would look like in a theater. And this is the Iasono system. You can see the panels that ring the room. This is only a little test room. In a movie theater, you can imagine how many of these panels there are. All the speakers were individually addressable, but it was still very heavily processed sound in order to get the motion to happen. And then Atmos, in theory, looks similar to the Aura 3D system, with the height speakers and then more surround speakers as well. There are some people that think the game is over already. Dolby obviously is a very formidable marketer. There's a lot of dubbing rooms in Hollywood, none of which were paid for by the dubbing room to have Atmos put in. There's a lot of resistance to doing more than blockbuster movies at the moment into this format, because there's only about 80 theaters in the United States and maybe another 120 worldwide. Their promotion is a lot like this, in my view. We're kind of back to this again. Oro, just last week, has an agreement with the biggest producer in India to put in 2 dubbing rooms and 120 movie theaters in India alone. The foreign markets are going to be very instrumental in this, because China and India both are making a lot of movies, and there's a lot of movie theaters being built in those places. So these are the challenges we have with immersive sound. The tools to interchange the motion elements are going to be very important. The National Association of Theater Owners in this country and the equivalent in France wrote a letter to all the standards organizations about this time last year and said, we're not going to support anything until there's one format. They don't want a standards war. They don't want the equivalent of a print with 4 different soundtracks on it. Most of the industry has taken that to heart. Most of the standards groups have taken it to heart. Dolby has yet to open their system up for us to integrate into an MDA tool. But we're hopeful that that's going to happen, because these systems are too expensive to install for the theaters to place a bet on which one is going to be successful. As sound engineers, that we have to develop a new language of how what works in these surround channels and what doesn't work. What motion is the audience interested in, or are they just really interested in static effects that are more realism based, but not as much motion. In 1987, I was in Beijing for the mix of the first Dolby Stereo movie. And in the first reel, they were panning the dialogue back and forth with the actors. And I said, yeah, you know, you really don't want to do that. And they said, yeah, we know, but you guys did it too when you started and had to learn the lesson the hard way. So they made a couple movies and panned the dialogue back and forth and then stopped that. So we have to do the same thing. We have to learn the language of what works to mix these movies into this kind of immersive sound. And we have to figure out some way to fix the problem with the collapse in the standards. The collapse in standards has affected the business in a lot of very dangerous ways. This one here in particular, which I'm sure very few of you know what that is. It's too fucking loud. A Dolby Atmos theater is capable of 135 dB plus. We had sound engineers, AES, our colleagues in Europe, came to my committee a year ago with serious problems in Europe, not just from Atmos, but because of the whole standards issue. When we went to digital soundtracks, full bandwidth digital soundtracks, we gave Hollywood an extra 20 dB of headroom. It's not headroom anymore, it's program. There's no headroom left. And so the theater owners then turned the sound down in the theater from calibrated level. They turned down from 7 to 5 to 4.5. That takes the dialogue from 85 down to 72 or 73, meaning that people don't hear the story. The serious problem comes in because the Belgium and Holland primarily now are threatening government action to control the sound levels in movie theaters, like they do in discos and in nightclubs and in live concerts, to where if the sound exceeds 102 dB for 30 seconds, the system will automatically take itself down by 20 dB for 5 minutes. The Europeans are frightening about this issue, and we have an AES subcommittee now that's working through some ways to try to deal with this. Perhaps a modification of the ITU standard to control sound on television is one thing that's being looked at. But the theaters in the US are no different. When the presentation was made to the SMPTE, engineering members of the SMPTE from the major studios made the following argument. It was a Second Amendment argument, substitute the word volume for gun. And they said it's Hollywood's absolute right to make the movies as loud as they want. Well, that's never been the right. But there's a lot of worry that it's an interference in the creative process. The other thing that happened was, and this was really a good thing too, along with the NATO thing, Sony Studios on the production end said, we're not putting any of these immersive systems in our studios until there's an interchange format. There's really only one studio in Hollywood that's fully committed to any one system, and I'm not going to tell you who that is because it's not really relevant. Everybody committed very quickly to digital sound in one form or another. They're not committing to this until we work the kinks out. So then we turn to ultra high definition and picture. This is a guy by the name of Doug Trumbull. In 1986, he started doing experiments on film, running film at 60 frames a second, The system is called ShowScan, you can see on the mag there. And eventually he started running 70mm film sideways at 60 frames a second to make the picture even bigger than it would have been normally. And the lack of motion artifacts is almost, it's what you'd want 3D to be. There's so much brightness and there's so much smoothness of motion. Because if you look at a motion picture frame where there's any motion at all, the frame is blurred. The motion is blurring the action, and in part that's what allows our brains to put the pictures back together. But wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to spend that time in our head, that you could just watch the movie? So we had all this push during that late 80s period to make the pictures bigger and bigger as well. And when we first started working on digital cinema, of course it was only 2K, but it wasn't any good for motion picture. And it wasn't any good until the manufacturers figured out how to do 4,000 lines. So then The Hobbit comes out, and 3 months into the shooting of The Hobbit, Peter Jackson tells Warner Brothers, oh, by the way, I'm shooting this at 48 frames a second. We didn't know if we even had any way to play it back. And all of the digital projectors needed firmware upgrades, and a lot of them, the firmware upgrade wouldn't help because they couldn't go that fast. But what The Hobbit did was, it gave us better motion out of the 3D, and it gave us more light, because instead of a 4 or 5 foot candle picture, we now had it 8 or 9, which was a lot closer to what normal is, which is 14. So we've had these kinds of experiments with high frame rate. So the standards groups now are looking at all of these different frame rates to be part of the standard. And it seems like a lot of numbers, but there's actually some reasons for doing that. In one experiment I know that they've done in Europe recently is if they're shooting live sports at night, there's a problem if you're shooting at 120 with the lighting in the stadium, which is at 50 cycles. We're still kind of duking it out here with the different speeds. To give you an idea of what the challenges we faced at 24 frames a second, this is another picture I worked on. This is actually right before on Golden Pond. Both of them were released the same year. This is a picture called Blowout that Brian De Palma directed. This shot that you're going to see is a shot where the camera is moving around a central axis, unmotivated by any action in the scene. And in fact, at a couple points, Travolta goes against the movement of the camera because the camera is just going to keep moving, and it moves faster and faster and faster. And it allows you to see the results of this kind of camera motion on the background, which is primarily what you're going to be looking at. There's not a lot of dialogue in here.
Hey, I thought you were working for me.
I am what's the problem?
We need the effects for the other reel. We made a list last week, remember?
All right, fine, I'll get them.
Hey, you'll get them? I haven't even got the screen for the first reel.
Yes.
you answer your phone? It's the police.
Who's been in here today?
Some guy. He said he wanted to...
Who? What guy? What guy?
I don't think I like your tone of voice.
Yes.
What the hell is the matter with you?
What?
That fucking tape you gave me didn't have nothing on it.
All my tapes are blank.
You know, I don't get you, man. First you feed me all this nutty assassination shit, then you give me a blank tape. What for?
Because somebody erased it. They've erased all my tapes.
Oh, yeah. They erased your tapes. What are they going to be doing? Trying to kill you next? You're fucking nuts.
Sally, it's Jack. Listen to me. I have to show you that film that I made.
This shows you how the language of film is changing. The cinematographer on this was Vilmos Zsigmond. One of the things he does with film is pre-flashes the negative before he shoots. It knocks the contrast down when he actually films. A lot of the old-time cinematographers are not happy about digital cinema and not happy about having to capture on something other than film. When we shot this about 15 times, that scene. And those of you that know motion picture know that there was a big group of people standing behind that camera trying to stay out of the shot. And people had cues to throw things, and we had to teach Travolta how to thread tape machines. So I'm sitting in dailies the next day, and every shot they play, as soon as the camera starts moving, it's just blurry and annoying. And me being, 28 years old and not knowing when to keep my mouth shut, I said, how can we put this in the movie? It's all blurry. You can't watch this. Well, when it's in the movie, it makes perfect sense, of course. And it's the last time I ever challenged a director. Movies aren't going to look like this in another 10 years. Movies are going to look like they were captured on video. And a lot of people are lamenting that. And maybe we'll have some tools for the avids to put scratches and dirt on the digital, I don't know. But the reality is the next generation is not going to know any different, and this is what, this is relegated to the history books. The other thing that's happening now with UHD TV, the primary proponents are the Japanese, they're Sony and NHK. Their laboratories are very extensively funded by their government, and everybody wants more numbers, no matter what they're doing. So these are the two projected formats, but these are also it's a lot of data to start moving around. We're not quite sure how that's going to happen yet. But there's all of this makes up one proposal. It's a change in the color space. Currently, television color is in this smaller triangle here. That's essentially defines all of the colors that we can reproduce. Well, the larger triangle is now what's proposed for UHD TV. So it's not only 4 times the pixels, but the pixels got to work a lot harder. And we want to do this at high frame rates. There's a lot of resistance coming from certain quarters now about the increase in pixel number, because the reality is, if you're getting pictures off of DirecTV or Comcast or any of those type delivery services, you're not getting 1,000 lines now, even though you're paying for them. There's a commercial running here in Chicago for Dodge Dart, and it's probably going to run until Christmas because it was a Christmassy commercial, and I'm still in the process of tracking it down because it's appalling. The car is going through a tunnel of Christmas lights that light up as the car is making its way through the tunnel. The picture completely collapses about 5 seconds into it because there's so much detail. If we go to 8,000 lines, where is all this? If they're going to have to compress the picture, are we going to end up with essentially a 1K picture anyway? The people who have seen high frame rate stuff think that that's the first direction we ought to be going in, is cleaning up the motion before we try to put more dots on the screen. As people start doing demonstrations, I'd urge you to go take a look for yourself, because it's going to be a big issue for all of us. All right. The topic of perceptual coding. This is the bugaboo to end all bugaboos. This is essentially why we have perceptual coding. I'm hopeful after the last couple AES conferences that we're coming out of the dark days of perceptual coding. The primary culprit in this has been two people, really, MPEG, Fraunhofer, and Apple. Because the ability to carry lots of music of dubious quality became more important to the generation. But the pipes get bigger eventually. And so we've seen Apple go to much higher numerical values in their coding. And we're starting to see discrete audio mixes being done again for 5-channel. We're finding more often than not that these codecs that were supposed to have been listened to really weren't listened to in a very serious way by people that are trained listeners. Because all of the codecs that I've heard, you're able to quickly zero in on what's missing. About 12 years ago, there was an AES conference in San Francisco where Sony was demonstrating a pro recorder using mini disc. You remember mini disc? And the first day of the convention, they had a bunch of headphones set up, and you had an A/B switch. You could listen for yourself between a CD and the MD disc playing the same material. And they had a big banner up, and it said, mini disc equal in quality to CD. Day 2 of the conference, the banner said, mini disc almost as good as CD. Because it was easy to hear the codec problems. Just at the conference we had in New York, there was a paper presented, the effective MP3 compression on timbre space of sustained music instrument tones. This is what I mean about these things haven't been tested properly. A group of young doctorate candidates in Hong Kong, listening just on their own, realized that when there were long tones from instruments into the MP3 codec, the aura around the sound, the background that was contained in that, fell away, and then you just had like a tone. And they've written a very extensive paper on just that subject. I fight like hell against these codecs, I tell you. This is the biggest problem, is that people start using codecs in tandem or in cascade. Projects get handed off from place to place, and nobody knows what's been done to them before, and it's gone through an encode to decode cycle, and you think you're getting full bandwidth audio, and you throw your favorite codec on it, and who knows what it's going to do. And a lot of bad things happen because of that. MPEG is pushing really hard now for something called MPEG-H, which they expect to be the perceptual coder for UHD TV audio going forward. And I sat with one of the MPEG people and I said, you've got a marketing problem and it's your name. I said, audio engineers hear MPEG and they think, ooh, that's bad. Well, there's a whole raft of MPEG solutions to audio, some using very few bits and some using a whole lot of bits. And the ones that use a whole lot of bits work really well. But because they haven't defined them with names, they're getting tarred for everything because it's all called MPEG something. So I think the days of perceptual coders are coming to an end. I hope so. The pipes are getting big enough in most places to carry what it is we need to carry. So the last thing is the end of film. Fuji stopped making all film, negative and positive motion picture film. AGFA will probably cease negative production this month. Kodak is still making negative, but Kodak's still in bankruptcy. Who knows what Kodak is going to do? The studios have told most countries, like Australia, that they will get no more prints of movies as of the end of this month. It's likely they're going to tell the American movie theaters that at the end of next year. I talked about the cinematographers aren't happy about that, but that's a lot of the old-time cinematographers. What this does is it removes the need to put certain words on movies that have been there forever. Dolby, DTS, SDDS. If there's no prints, those companies don't have any proprietariness left in the film industry. And we're then basically back to doing what we do, is audio, like everybody else does it. So these are kind of my rules for being an audio engineer. And then these are some of the unresolved issues that the standards process is going to have to take a hold of. I'm a 20-year member of the SMPTE standards process. We now have an AES process that's working on standards in this area. I'm, oddly enough, the Australian representative for ISO, and I'm on the ITU now as well for Australia, because I live there most of the time. But that's good, because that gives us another place to push for quality audio instead of limiting the amount of space that we have for the audio. So I've got some extra reading here. It'll be in the videotape, and I'll make sure that it gets sent out to everybody. This one, even with just the URL, you can tell what it's about. It's one of my favorite subjects. Floyd Tool, I did actually find the logo, see? Floyd Tool, this, Floyd is my hero. All of the science that we do ultimately is to service the people who are making things on the front end, and that's where I came from. And this is where I'm going to next week after I finish at SMPTE. That's the beach block from my house in Australia. You're all welcome to visit. Thank you very much.